They were dropped into a world where every shadow could kill, where the jungle swallowed entire battalions, and victory was measured in inches. From the brutal meat grinder at Con Thien to the forgotten battles no one talks about, from the blood-soaked slopes of Hamburger Hill to Australia's deadliest fight deep in the jungle. This is the untold story of the Vietnam War's most intense and devastating battles. A 2-hour journey through hell, courage, and sacrifice. And as we relive these moments, we honor every veteran who fought, bled, and sacrificed. It is because of people like them that history was written. What you're about to see is not a movie. It's what really happened. Welcome to the war. And if you enjoy this deep dive into history, don't forget to hit like and let us know in the comments which battle left the biggest impact on you. The Battle of Dak To, the brutal struggle in the Vietnam Highlands in the dense, unforgiving jungles of Vietnam, where visibility was reduced to mere yards and the air was thick with humidity, a brutal confrontation was about to unfold. It was June 1967, and the paratroopers of the 173rd Airborne Brigade were deep in the Central Highlands hunting for the enemy. Suddenly, the eerie silence of the jungle was shattered. Gunfire erupted, and a relentless wave of North Vietnamese Army NVA soldiers came crashing down on them. What followed was one of the most grueling and bloodiest battles of the Vietnam War, the Battle of Dak To. This was no ordinary fight. It was a test of endurance, courage, and sheer will to survive. American troops faced ambushes, relentless assaults, and brutal hand-to-hand combat, all while navigating impossible terrain for weeks. They fought under constant fire, pushing their limits in a desperate struggle to hold their ground. Before we dive into this gripping story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and leave a comment. What do you think was the most intense battle of the Vietnam War? Let us know below. Now let's step into the chaos of Dak To, the strategic importance of Dak To. In early 1967, the Central Highlands of Vietnam became a critical battleground. The U.S. Military Assistance Command received intelligence that the North Vietnamese Army NVA was building up forces in the region. Their goal was clear: cut off enemy supply routes and stop NVA troops from entering South Vietnam from Cambodia and Laos. At the same time, the NVA had a plan of their own. Instead of fighting large American units, they wanted to surround and destroy smaller U.S. forces. They set deadly traps, prepared strong defensive positions, and waited for the right moment to strike. The region's thick jungle and steep hills gave the NVA an advantage. They knew the terrain, while U.S. soldiers struggled in the extreme conditions. To stop the growing NVA threat, the U.S. sent in the 4th Infantry Division and the 173rd Airborne Brigade, a group of highly trained paratroopers. But instead of waiting for the enemy to attack us, commanders chose a different approach. Major General William R. Pye ordered a series of search and destroy missions designed to hunt down enemy forces before they could strike first. This decision led to Operation Francis Marion in April 1967, where U.S. forces clashed with NVA troops in small but fierce battles. These skirmishes became more frequent, and by June, the U.S. realized the NVA was sending even more troops to the area. The stage was set for a full-scale battle. The 173rd Airborne Brigade was about to face one of its toughest challenges, yet the early clashes April-June 1967. By April 1967, the U.S. Army had begun Operation Francis Marion, a mission to disrupt the NVA's growing presence in the Central Highlands. American commanders believed they could control the area by launching search and destroy missions, but the terrain and weather worked against them. The thick jungle, steep hills, and heavy rainfall made movement slow and exhausting. Soldiers carried up to 100 pounds of gear, including weapons, ammunition, and supplies, earning them the nickname Elephant Soldiers. The first battles begin. At first, U.S. troops encountered small groups of NVA soldiers, but by late April, they faced much larger, well-organized enemy forces. One of the first major engagements happened near Dak To, where American infantry units fought an intense battle against an NVA battalion. Both sides suffered heavy casualties, but it was clear that the enemy was growing stronger in the region as weeks passed. Skirmishes increased. More U.S. troops were deployed, including paratroopers from the 173rd Airborne Brigade. By June, the situation had become critical. The NVA was launching larger and more aggressive attacks. The Battle of the Slopes, a devastating defeat on June 22, 1967. The 2nd Battalion, 5003d Infantry Regiment, was sent to patrol Hill 1338, a high point that offered a strategic view of the surrounding Jungle. Alpha Company led the way, moving carefully through the dense foliage. Visibility was almost zero, and the thick fog made it impossible to see more than a few yards ahead. Suddenly, the jungle erupted with gunfire. Hundreds of NVA soldiers ambushed the paratroopers from multiple directions. The attack was swift and brutal. Wave after wave of enemy troops charged at the Americans, forcing them into hand-to-hand combat. Soldiers fought using bayonets, rifle butts, and even their fists to hold their ground. Despite their bravery, Alpha Company was overwhelmed. One by one, soldiers were shot down. Many called for artillery and air support, but bad weather prevented reinforcements from arriving in time. The fight lasted for hours, but by the end of the day, more than half of Alpha Company was dead. Few survivors escaped through the jungle, carrying their wounded as best they could. The aftermath, a wake-up call. The Battle of the Slopes was a disaster for the U.S. Army. 76 American soldiers were killed, making it one of the worst single battle losses of the 173rd Airborne Brigade. Survivors described the horror of seeing their friends' slaughtered bodies left behind, and the enemy showing no mercy. The battle shocked us commanders. They now understood that the NVA was much stronger and more organized than expected. American forces had underestimated their enemy, and the fight for Dak To was far from over. In response, the U.S. sent more troops and supplies to the region. The 1st and 3rd Brigades of the 1st Air Cavalry Division and the elite South Vietnamese Airborne Task Force were brought in to strengthen defenses. By the end of the summer, the number of U.S. troops in Dak To had doubled. Despite these reinforcements, the NVA was not finished. They had a much bigger plan in mind, and the worst was yet to come. The Battle of Dak To was about to reach a whole new level of brutality, the calm before the storm. July-October 1967, after the Battle of the Slopes, the U.S. Army knew that the North Vietnamese Army, NVA, was planning something big. The heavy losses in June proved that the enemy was not only well organized, but also determined to push U.S. forces out of the Central Highlands. However, by late summer, NVA attacks suddenly decreased. The jungle became quiet, and U.S. troops found fewer enemy soldiers in the area. At first, American commanders thought they had won. Perhaps the NVA had suffered too many casualties and retreated. But in reality, the enemy was preparing for something much bigger. The NV's secret plan, while the Americans were reinforcing their positions. The NVA was regrouping and bringing in thousands of fresh troops. By October 1967, they had deployed over 6,000 soldiers, including 3 full regiments, 24th, 32nd, and 66th, and another in reserve, 174th. They were supported by the 40th Artillery Regiment, which meant they had more firepower than before. The NV's goal was not just to fight American troops. They wanted to trick them. Their real strategy was to draw as many U.S. forces as possible into the Central Highlands. If enough American troops were tied up in Dak To, they would be too weak to defend major cities during the Tet Offensive. A massive attack planned for January 1968 to prepare for battle. The NV built miles of tunnels, trenches, and bunkers. Some of these defenses took over 6 months to construct, making them incredibly strong. The Americans had no idea how well prepared their enemy was. Operation MacArthur. October-November 1967. By October 1967, ES commanders knew that the NVA was not finished in Dak To. Intelligence reports showed that large enemy forces were still hiding in the jungle, waiting for the right time to strike to take control of the region. The U.S. launched Operation MacArthur on October 12, 1967. The goal was simple: find and destroy the enemy before they could launch a full-scale attack. The operation involved the 4th Infantry Division and the 173rd Airborne Brigade, along with South Vietnamese forces. The battle was about to escalate, and the paratroopers of the 173rd would soon face their toughest fight. Yet the battle for Hill 8823, a deadly trap as part of Operation MacArthur, the 173rd Airborne Brigade was sent on search and destroy missions near Hills 8, 23, and 875, located close to the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a major supply route for the NVA. On November 4, 1967, Bravo Company, 4th Battalion, 5003, D Infantry Regiment was ordered to clear Hill, 823 of enemy forces. The soldiers advanced, carefully knowing the NVA was likely hiding in the dense jungle. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by machine gun fire and mortar explosions. The NVA had been waiting. They were dug in with fortified bunkers and hidden trenches. The paratroopers were caught in a deadly ambush for hours. The battle raged on. The NV's position was nearly impossible to attack, as their trenches were interconnected by tunnels, allowing them to reinforce their positions quickly. Every time a bunker was cleared, a new enemy crew would take over, realizing they could not break through on their own. The paratroopers called for artillery support using beehive rounds, shells filled with thousands of steel darts. The artillery created gaps in the NVA defenses. This allowed the paratroopers to push forward and finally take the hill. But the victory came at a high cost. Many American soldiers were killed or wounded, and the survivors knew that this was just the beginning of the real battle. The pursuit of the enemy, a costly mistake after capturing Hill. 823 U.S. commanders believed that the NVA was retreating. They ordered Task Force Black and Task Force Blue, made up of units from the 1st Battalion, 5003 Infantry Regiment, to chase after the enemy and destroy them before they could regroup on November 10, 1967. Task Force Black followed an end, VA communication wire left behind in the jungle. They assumed it would lead them to a retreating enemy force. Instead, it led them straight into an ambush. The 8th and 9th Battalions of the NV 66 Regiment were waiting the moment the paratroopers entered the area. They were hit with heavy machine gun fire and RPGs. Task Force Black was completely surrounded. Captain Thomas M.Y.I., the unit's commander, called for reinforcements, but the thick jungle delayed their arrival. The soldiers had no choice but to fight for their lives. One of the heroes that day was Private First Class John Barnes. When an NVA grenade landed near a group of wounded soldiers, he threw himself onto the grenade, absorbing the explosion to save his fellow paratroopers. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for his bravery. It took an entire day for reinforcements to arrive. When Task Force Blue finally made it through the jungle, the combined forces were able to push back the NVA and escape the deadly trap. But the battle had been devastating. The 173rd Airborne had suffered heavy losses, and morale was beginning to drop. The soldiers knew that something even worse was coming. The final showdown at Hill 875. The battle intensifies. Dak to airfield under siege by November 12, 1967, as U.S. forces struggled through the dense jungles and brutal ambushes of Dak to the north. Vietnamese Army NVA launched a direct assault on the Dak to airfield. This was no random attack. The NVA had been preparing for months, and their goal was to Nam. U.S. air operations in the region. The NVA strikes first under the cover of darkness. NVA artillery and mortar teams unleashed a massive bombardment on the Dak To airfield. Hundreds of shells rained down, destroying ammunition, depots, fuel supplies, and aircraft. The attack lasted for 3 straight days, making it nearly impossible for helicopters to resupply U.S. troops in the field. The most devastating moment came when a mortar round hit a storage area full of C4 explosives. The explosion was so powerful that it could be felt a mile away. Some reports suggest it was one of the largest explosions of the entire Vietnam War during the siege. The NVA destroyed 2 C-130 Hercules transport planes, cutting off vital supply lines. The attack caused over 1,100 tons of munitions and fuel to go up in flames, making it one of the most successful enemy assaults on an American base in the war. Despite the chaos, U.S. troops held their ground. They used bunker positions and counter-artillery fire to slow down the enemy, preventing them from advancing further into the base. But the damage had already been done. The paratroopers in the jungle were now dangerously low on supplies, securing the high ground Hill 1338 and Hill 882. Realizing that the NVA was using the surrounding hills to launch their attacks, U.S. commanders ordered their troops to take back the high ground. One of the first targets was Hill 1338, which overlooked the Dak To Valley. The fighting lasted for 2 days, with U.S. troops facing heavy resistance. As they climbed the hill, when they finally reached the top, they discovered an intricate system of tunnels and bunkers showing just how well prepared the NVA had been. Meanwhile, 6 miles to the west, Alpha Company, 1st Battalion, 5003 Infantry Regiment was sent to clear Hill 882 on November 16th. They engaged what seemed to be a small group of NVA soldiers, but as soon as they fired, a massive enemy force hidden in trenches returned fire with AK-47s and grenades. The paratroopers immediately called in airstrikes and artillery fire, but the thick jungle made it difficult to target the enemy bombs, and NP Palm fell, but many enemy positions remained untouched. The battle continued for 2 days with NVA forces launching wave after wave of counterattacks. At one point, the paratroopers had to protect a group of war correspondents who were dangerously trapped in the middle of the firefight. Interestingly, the reporters were given priority for evacuation even before some seriously wounded soldiers. By November 19th, after days of intense combat, U.S. troops finally secured H-882, but they had suffered heavy casualties and the battle was far from over, because just a few miles away, a bloodbath was about to unfold on the deadliest battleground of the entire campaign. Hill 875. The bloodbath on Hill 875. November 18th to 23rd, 1967. By mid-November 1967, after weeks of brutal jungle warfare, the battle was about to reach its deadliest phase. The North Vietnamese Army NVA had suffered losses, but they were far from defeated. They had prepared their final stand on Hill 875, a steep, heavily fortified position that overlooked the entire Dak To region. Taking the hill would be the key to securing the area, but it would cost American soldiers more than they ever expected. The first assault, a deadly mistake on November 18, 1967, a small U.S. Special Forces unit was sent to scout Hill 8775. What they found was terrifying: an entire NVA regiment. The 174th was dug into deep, well-constructed bunkers. The NV's position was nearly impenetrable, with 3 layers of trenches, tunnels, and machine gun nests. Realizing they were outnumbered, the Special Forces team pulled back and called for reinforcements. The 2nd Battalion, 5003 Infantry Regiment was ordered to attack the hill and clear out the enemy. However, due to heavy casualties in previous battles, the battalion was understrength with only 290 troops instead of the expected 450. Still, they prepared for battle that night. U.S. artillery and airstrikes pounded the hill, preparing the way for the main attack the next morning. November 19th, the trap is set at 9 a.m. On November 19th, Delta Company led the assault with Charlie Comp on the right flank and Alpha Company in reserve. The paratroopers climbed up the ridge, moving through a mess of fallen trees and shattered terrain caused by the previous night's bombing runs. Then the first soldier in Delta Company climbed over a fallen tree limb and was instantly shot dead. The jungle erupted with gunfire. NVA troops were hiding everywhere, waiting for the Americans to enter their kill zone. Machine guns, mortars, and RPGs ran down on the soldiers within minutes. Delta and Charlie companies were pinned down, unable to move at 1 p.m. The paratroopers launched a second attack, trying to break through the enemy line. First Sergeant Leonard Duran of Delta Company managed to throw a grenade into a bunker, killing its crew. But the NV's tunnel system allowed new soldiers to replace them immediately. Things went from bad to worse when U.S. artillery mistakenly fired on friendly troops, killing and wounding several Americans with casualties. Rising Captain Eugene Kiley of Alpha Company ordered a retreat down the hill. At the same time, a small 4-man observation team was ambushed. One of the soldiers' specialists for Carlos Loada saw the NVA moving in to encircle the entire company. Knowing that if he stopped firing, his entire unit would be wiped out, he refused to retreat. Loda kept his machine gun firing until he was mortally wounded. His bravery allowed his comrades to escape, and he was later posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. But Lozada's sacrifice wasn't enough to stop the NVA. By the afternoon of November 19th, Alpha Company was overrun, and Captain Kiley was killed. The 2nd Battalion, 5003d Infantry Regiment was now completely surrounded. Ammunition was running low, and rescue helicopters couldn't reach them because of the heavy enemy fire. November 20th, holding out for survival as night fell on November 20th. The paratroopers dug into defensive positions, fighting to survive with no fresh supplies. Many wounded soldiers had to bandage themselves using strips of cloth from the dead at dawn. The 4th Battalion, 53rd Infantry Regiment was sent to relieve the survivors. But the journey through the jungle was slow and dangerous. By 5:30 p.m. Bravo Company finally reached the base of Hill 875, linking up with the trapped paratroopers, Major William Kelly. The executive officer of the 2nd Battalion was flown in by helicopter to take command with supplies still low and enemy forces everywhere. Kelly knew that if they didn't take the hill soon, they would all die there. November 21st to 22nd. The final assault on November 21st, U.S. forces launched a third major attack on Hill 875. This time they used everything they had, artillery airstrikes and a full battalion assault. But the NVA was still there waiting for them as the paratroopers advanced. They were met with relentless enemy fire. They reached the first line of enemy trenches, but were too exhausted to push forward further. The battle had now dragged on for 4 days, and both sides had suffered enormous casualties. By November 2nd, the smell of death and burnt trees filled the air. The 173rd Airborne Brigade was running out of men, and there were no fresh reinforcements available. Many paratroopers were too weak to fight, surviving on only a few sips of water per day. Then on November 23rd, Thanksgiving Day, the final push began. The 4th Battalion, 5003 Infantry Regiment attacked from one side, while the 1st Battalion, 12th Infantry Regiment climbed from the other. The NVA fired back, but their numbers had dwindled. The Americans finally reached the top of Hill 875 at 11:22 a.m. When they got there, the NVA was gone. The North Vietnamese had escaped through their tunnels, abandoning their fortified position after nearly a week of brutal combat. The battle was finally over, but the price was unimaginable. The cost of victory when the 173rd Airborne Brigade was pulled back to Dak to only 130 men remained uninjured. The final death toll for the Battle of Hill 875 was 361 Americans killed, 15 missing, and 1,441 wounded. Over 1,000 NVA soldiers were killed, but the battle had drained American morale. The soldiers were exhausted, battered, and scarred from the nightmare they had endured. To make matters worse, First General William Westmoreland, the U.S. commander in Vietnam, downplayed the losses, calling the battle a major victory. In reality, American forces had been nearly wiped out, and the NVA had succeeded in distracting the U.S. before the Tet Offensive for the paratroopers of the 173rd Airborne. The battle would never be forgotten. They had fought with everything they had, but many never made it home. The aftermath and legacy, the Battle of Dak To, was finally over, but the cost had been devastating. The 173rd Airborne Brigade had fought bravely, but they had suffered one of the highest casualty rates of the Vietnam War. Many survivors were scarred physically and mentally after enduring weeks of brutal jungle warfare. The true cost of the battle: in total, 361 American soldiers were killed, 15 were missing, and 1,441 were wounded. The NVA suffered over 1,000 casualties, but despite their losses, they had achieved their goal. The battle had successfully distracted U.S. forces from the upcoming Tet Offensive in January 1968. Even worse, 40 U.S. helicopters were shot down during the 3 weeks of fighting, limiting the ability to resupply soldiers and evacuate the wounded. Survivors described horrific conditions, with bodies left in the jungle, and soldiers having to bandage themselves with scraps from the dead. For many Vietnam veterans, Dak To was a battle they never forgot. The nightmare of Hill 875 haunted them, and the sense of being abandoned in the jungle, outnumbered and outgunned, remained with them for the rest of their lives. Was Dak To a victory? Officially, U.S. commanders claimed victory. General William Westmoreland, the highest-ranking U.S. officer in Vietnam, stated that the enemy had been defeated. He insisted that at no point were U.S. troops trapped or in danger of being wiped out. But the soldiers on the ground knew the truth. Many believed that Westmoreland's statement was a lie, covering up the fact that they had been lured into a battle they were never meant to win. The NVA had drawn American forces into the jungle, weakened them, and then vanished into the mountains, only to return stronger for the Tet Offensive. Just 2 months later, the legacy of the 173rd Airborne Brigade. Despite the heavy losses, The paratroopers of the 173rd Airborne continued fighting in Vietnam. They had earned a reputation for bravery and resilience, proving themselves in one of the most brutal battles of the war. Two soldiers, Private First Class, John Barnes, and Specialist for Carlos Lota, were posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for their incredible acts of heroism. Their stories remain a testament to the courage and sacrifice of American soldiers in Vietnam. 9. Conclusion. The Battle of Dak To was one of the most brutal and costly engagements of the Vietnam War. The 173rd Airborne Brigade fought with unmatched bravery, facing overwhelming odds in the dense jungles and steep hills of the Central Highlands. Though the U.S. claimed victory, the battle had weakened American forces just months before the Tet Offensive, a turning point in the war. To all the soldiers who fought and sacrificed in joy to your bravery will never be forgotten. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more incredible war history. See you in the next one. 1967. Deep in the jungles of Vietnam, U.S. Marines fought one of the most brutal and relentless battles of the war. Operation Kingfisher. This operation, fought near the Demilitarized Zone, DMZ, was a deadly clash between the United States Marine Corps USMC and the North Vietnamese Army NVA. It was a fight for survival, a fight for territory, and a fight that would leave a lasting mark on history. The Vietnam War was not just about battles. It was about the men who fought them. The Marines who endured the hell of Conan faced not only the enemy, but also constant artillery bombardment, deadly ambushes, and the unforgiving jungle terrain. Many never made it home. To all the veterans who served in Vietnam, we honor and thank you for your bravery and sacrifice. Your courage will never be forgotten. If you love history, if you respect the sacrifices made by those who served, then hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. It helps us tell the stories of these incredible battles and ensures that their legacy lives on. Stay with us as we take a deep dive into one of the bloodiest and most intense battles of the Vietnam War. Operation Kingfisher. This is a story of courage, sacrifice, and the brutal reality of war. Let's begin to understand Operation Kingfisher. We first need to understand the battlefield. The Demilitarized Zone DMZ was supposed to be a buffer zone separating North and South Vietnam, but in reality it was one of the most dangerous places in the entire war. The North Vietnamese Army NBA used the area to launch attacks into the south, while U.S. forces, mainly the United States Marine Corps or USMC, tried to stop them. At the heart of this deadly battleground stood Ken, a small but heavily fortified U.S. Marine outpost. Ken was meant to be an early warning base, a way to stop the NBA from pushing south, but in reality it became a living nightmare for the Marine station there. The outpost was constantly bombarded with artillery mortars and rocket fire. Marines nicknamed it the meat grinder, because that's exactly what it was. The U.S. strategy was simple: find the enemy, engage them, destroy them. Marines conducted search and destroy missions deep into enemy territory, but this was risky. The NVA knew the terrain better, used booby traps, ambushes, and hidden bunkers to their advantage, and often lured Marines into deadly traps. By mid-1967, U.S. commanders saw that the NVA was massing troops for a major offensive near the DMZ. In response, they launched Operation Kingfisher, a large-scale offensive meant to hit the enemy hard and push them back before they could strike first. What followed was one of the most brutal battles of the Vietnam War. The Marines had their orders, the NVA had their plan, and in the jungles of Vietnam, a deadly showdown was about to begin. By mid-1967, the U.S. military knew something big was coming. North Vietnamese forces were massing near the DMZ, bringing in thousands of troops, heavy weapons, and artillery. Intelligence reports showed that the NVA was preparing for a major offensive, one that could threaten US bases and even push deeper into South Vietnam. The Marines couldn't wait for the enemy to strike first. They had to take the fight to the NVA. That's when U.S. commanders launched Operation Kingfisher. The goal: engage and destroy the enemy before they could attack. The operation was planned as a large-scale sweep targeting enemy positions around Con Thien in the surrounding jungle. The 2nd Battalion, 4th Marines, 24, and other Marine units would move into NVA territory, hunt down their forces, and wipe them out. But this was no simple mission. The NVI had been preparing for months, building bunkers, digging tunnels, and setting deadly traps. The Marines knew the risks. The jungles and hedge RS provided perfect cover for enemy ambushes. The enemy's artillery, hidden just across the DMZ, could rain down on them at any time. And worst of all, the NVA would fight to the last man. Still, the Marines pressed forward. They were battle-hardened, trained for war, and ready for anything. What they didn't know was that the enemy was already waiting for them with a plan that would lead to some of the most brutal and bloody battles of the Vietnam War. The trap was set, and soon the first shots of Operation Kingfisher would be fired, before the sun even rose on the 13th of September. 1967 war came to Ken under the cover of darkness. A full company of North Vietnamese soldiers moved silently toward the northeastern perimeter of the Marine stronghold at Ken. Their mission was simple: break through, overrun the bases, and wipe out the Marines inside. But the Marines were ready. For weeks, they had been on high alert, knowing the enemy was close, as the first waves of NVA troops reached the perimeter. They were met with a wall of gunfire. Machine guns roared, rifles cracked, mortars exploded. The battle turned into chaos as Marines fought off wave after wave of enemy soldiers. Then came the artillery support as howitzers from nearby fire bases unleashed devastating barrage on the attacking NVA forces. Explosions ripped through the jungle, sending dirt, shrapnel, and bodies flying. The enemy had no choice but to fall back into the darkness. The attack had failed. The NVA retreated, leaving behind dead and wounded. But the battle was far from over. This was just the beginning. The attack on Ken was a warning, a signal that a much larger battle was about to take place. The Marines had survived the night, but Operation Kingfisher is about to turn into one of the deadliest fights of the Vietnam War. Just over a week after the failed attack on Ken, the Marines took the fight to the enemy. On September 21st, 1967, 2nd Battalion, 4th Marines 24, launched a sweep operation south of the DMZ, east of Con. The goal: flush out enemy forces hiding in the thick jungle and destroy them. 3 Marine companies, E, F, and G, moved through dense hedge RSA terrain perfect for an ambush. And that's exactly what was waiting for them. Suddenly, machine guns opened fire from multiple directions. Mortars and RPGs exploded all around them. The NVA had set a perfect trap, a deadly pinwheel ambush surrounding the Marines in a crossfire of bullets and shrapnel. The battle turned into a desperate fight for survival. Marines took cover in the mud, returning fire as best they could. But the enemy was everywhere. Snipers picked off squad leaders, explosions shattered trees, sending deadly splinters into the air. Despite the chaos, the Marines fought back with everything they had. Close air support was called in. Jets screamed overhead, dropping bombs dangerously close to Marine positions. Helicopter gunships unleashed rockets and machine gun fire. The battlefield was on fire by nightfall. The Marines managed to break free and fall back, but at a terrible cost. 16 Marines were killed, 18 were wounded. The NVA, who had planned the ambush, perfectly suffered about 39 confirmed dead, but their true losses remained unknown. Worst of all, 15 Marine bodies had to be left behind, a gut-wrenching reality of war. The survivors had no choice but to withdraw, leaving their fallen brothers in enemy-controlled territory. It would take weeks before they could return to recover them. This battle was a harsh lesson in the dangers of fighting in the DMZ. Giving terrain, the NVA were not just hiding, they were waiting, planning, and striking with deadly precision. And the worst was still to come. The night of October 14th, 1967, started like any other for the Marines of 2nd Battalion. 4th Marines stationed near the Washout Bridge, a key position between Ken and Strongo C2. But as they settled in for the night, the North Vietnamese Army NVA had other plans. At exactly 1:25 a.m., the silence was shattered. A massive artillery barrage came crashing down on the Marine positions. Explosions ripped through the night sky, throwing dirt, debris, and shrapnel in every direction. The NBA's heavy guns, positioned just across the DMZ, rained fire down for nearly an hour, softening up the Marines for what was coming next under the cover of the bombardment. Hundreds of NVA soldiers crept forward, using the darkness to their advantage. At 2:30 a.m., they launched a full-scale assault, striking the flank of Company G. With terrifying force, RPGs blasted through machine gun nests, and enemy sappers breached the perimeter. In the chaos, Company G's command post was overrun. Their company commander, platoon leaders, and forward observer were all killed, leaving the unit. Leaderless, hand-to-hand combat erupted with Marines and NBA soldiers fighting at close range with bayonets, knives, and rifle butts. But the Marines refused to break. Company F rushed in to reinforce the battered defenders. At the same time, AC-47 spooky gunships arrived overhead, spraying thousands of rounds per minute into enemy positions. The tide of the battle slowly began to turn. By 4:30 a.m., the NVA were forced to retreat. The ground was littered with bodies, both American and enemy. The Marines had held their ground, but at a devastating cost. 2021. Marines were killed, 23 more were wounded, the NVA left behind. 24 confirmed dead. Though their true losses were likely much higher, this attack proved just how far the NVA were willing to go. They attacked in waves, took massive casualties, and kept coming, but it also proved the determination and grit of the U.S. Marines who held the line, despite being outnumbered and nearly overwhelmed. And still, Operation Kingfisher was not over. The final battles were yet to come. By late October 1967, Operation Kingfisher was nearing its final phase. The Marines had fought off wave after wave of NBA assaults, but the enemy was still out there hiding, waiting, and ready to strike. On October 25th, 2nd Battalion, 4th Marines, 24 launched a final sweep north from K along Route 561, pushing toward the DMZ. The terrain was thick with brush, making visibility difficult. It was the perfect place for an ambush, but for most of the day, no contact was made. Then as night fell, the sky lit up with fire. NVA artillery and rockets rained down on the Marines' positions, pounding them. For hours, the battalion executive officer was killed, and even the commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel James Hammond, was wounded. Despite the chaos, the Marines held their ground. By October 26th. The Marines continued their advance, pushing deeper into enemy territory. As they moved forward, NVA mortar and small arms fire erupted. Helicopters arrived to evacuate the wounded, but the enemy was ready. An NVA machine gun crew shot down a 34 transport chopper, killing the pilot and door gunner. A second helicopter was also hit, crash landing nearby. Realizing a bigger attack might be coming, Lieutenant Colonel John Stutt, who took over command, called for reinforcements. Company F was ordered to move in along with 2 companies from 3rd Battalion, 3rd Marines. The night of October 26 to 27 was one of constant battle. The NVA probed the Marine lines, launching several ground attacks under the cover of mortar fire. The Marines fought back with machine guns, grenades, and close air support, pushing back every enemy assault. By 2 a.m. on October 27th, the enemy finally withdrew at first light. Marines found 19 dead NBAA soldiers around their perimeter. Though the true number was likely much higher, the Marines suffered 8 killed and 45 wounded over the 2-day battle. But they had held the line once again. This marked the last major battle of Operation Kingfisher. The fighting had been brutal, costly, and relentless, but the Marines had stood their ground. Just days later, on October 31st, 1967, Operation Kingfisher officially ended. But the war was far from over. After 3 months of brutal combat, Operation Kingfisher officially ended on October 31st, 1967. The Marines had fought through deadly ambushes, constant artillery bombardments, and relentless NBAA attacks. But what had they achieved from a tactical perspective? The operation prevented the NVA from launching a major offensive south of the DMZ. The Marines had inflicted heavy casualties, with over 1,100 confirmed enemy dead, and many more likely killed. The NVA had been pushed back, but not destroyed from a human perspective. The cost was devastating. 340 U.S. Marines lost their lives, and 1,461 were wounded. Some died in firefights, others in artillery barges, and some were left behind on the battlefield. Their bodies recovered. Weeks later, the scars of Kingfisher would remain forever with those who survived strategically. The war continued. Even before Kingfisher ended, the Marines immediately transitioned into Operation Kentucky, another search and destroy mission in the same area. The NVA still controlled the northern jungle, and U.S. forces would have to keep fighting for every inch of ground for the Marines who fought in Kingfisher. This battle was a test of courage, resilience, and sheer determination. They fought against overwhelming odds, never backing down, despite ambushes, artillery fire, in the harsh jungle terrain. Today we remember their bravery, their sacrifice, and their legacy. The battle may have ended, but the story of Operation Kingfisher must never be forgotten. Operation Kingfisher was led by the 3rd Marine, Amphibious Force 3rd MAF, with units primarily from the 3rd Marine Division. The key battalions involved included 2nd Battalion, 4th Marines 2/4, engaged in multiple battles, including the ambush at the Trace and the night attack at Washout Bridge, 3rd Battalion, 3rd Marines 3/3, reinforced 2/4 during the final sweeps of the operation, 2nd Battalion, 9th Marines 2/9, conducted search and destroy missions near the DMZ, 3rd Battalion, 9th Marines 3NS assisted in securing Con and engaging enemy forces. 3rd Battalion, 26 Marines 326 took part in defensive operations and counterattacks. The Marines relied heavily on armor and air support, including M48 tanks from the 3rd Tank Battalion LVTE amphibious vehicles and M50 Onos tank destroyers armed with recoilless rifles artillery support from the 12th Marines helicopter squadrons for troop transport and medical evacuation. The primary enemy force was the Pavan 324B Division, one of the most battle-hardened units in the NBA. This division included 812 Regiment, responsible for several major attacks, including the Conan assault artillery and sapper units used to bombard Marine positions and conduct close-quarters infiltration. The NVA had the advantage of terrain and artillery support from just across the DMZ, making them a deadly and highly coordinated force U.S. Marine casualties operation. Kingfisher was one of the costliest battles of the Vietnam War for the U.S. Marines over the course of 3 months. 340 Marines were killed in action. Kia 1,461 were wounded, dozens were missing or left behind in enemy territory, only to be recovered later. Many Marines were lost in ambushes, night attacks, and relentless artillery bombardments. The battle at the Trace on September 21st saw 118 Marines wounded in a single day, while the October 14th attack at Washout Bridge nearly wiped out an entire company's leadership. NBAA casualties, U.S. forces reported 1,117 confirmed NVA killed body count, an estimated 1,942 additional enemy deaths from airstrikes and artillery. Only 5 enemy soldiers captured while U.S. firepower inflicted heavy losses. The NBA continued to fight aggressively, showing no fear of high casualties, equipment, and battlefield damage. U.S. losses. At least one 34 helicopter was shot down, with the crew killed. Several M48 Patton tanks and armored vehicles were damaged or destroyed by RPG fire. Conan and nearby fire bases were shelled daily, requiring constant repair. NVA losses. Hundreds of weapons were captured from dead enemy soldiers. Multiple bunkers, tunnels, and artillery positions were destroyed. The battlefield around Conan was left scarred and cratered, a haunting reminder of the brutal fighting the Marines relied on search and destroy missions to find and eliminate enemy forces before they could launch large-scale attacks. Their key strategies included mobile patrols and sweeps moving through enemy territory and large groups to locate NVA positions. Combined Arms Coordination infantry units worked alongside M48 Patton tanks on TOS tank destroyers and amphibious armored vehicles for added firepower, artillery, and air support. The Marines used howitzers, airstrikes, and helicopter gunships to suppress enemy positions before engaging fortified defenses at outposts like Ken. The Marines built trenches, bunkers, and barbed wire obstacles to slow down enemy attacks. Ambush tactics. Quick reaction forces were on standby to reinforce units caught in enemy traps. These tactics helped the Marines hold their ground, but the enemy was just as deadly. NVA tactics. The North Vietnamese Army, NVA, used guerrilla tactics, hit-and-run strikes, and overwhelming force to wear down the Marines. Their key strategies included ambushes luring Marines into kill zones with hidden snipers, machine guns, and RPGs, artillery bombardment, firing hundreds of shells per day at U.S. bases from just across the DMZ. Close quarters, assaults rushing into Marine positions at night to engage in hand-to-hand combat, preventing airstrikes from being called in. Tunnel warfare, using underground bunkers and tunnels to hide troops and supplies, making them hard to locate. Sapper attacks. Small enemy units infiltrated bases with explosives to destroy bunkers, and weapons caches. Challenges for the Marines, harsh terrain, thick jungle, hedge RS, and deep mud made movements slow and dangerous. Constant artillery fire Conan and surrounding bases were hit by over 1,200 enemy shells per day at the peak of the battle. Difficult evacuations helicopters were often shot down trying to evacuate wounded Marines' enemy reinforcements. The NBA could retreat across the DMZ, where U.S. forces couldn't follow mental and physical exhaustion. The Marines fought in extreme heat. Heavy rain, despite these challenges, the Marines stood their ground and fought back with everything they had. Their determination prevented the NVA from gaining control of Ken, but at a heavy cost. By October 31st, the 1967 Operation Kingfisher officially ended, but the war in the DMZ was far from over. The Marines had prevented the NBA from making a major breakthrough. But the cost was high. 340 Marines were killed, 1,461 wounded, and many more carried the physical and emotional scars of battle. The NVA suffered over 1,100 confirmed deaths, with possibly thousands more lost to artillery airstrikes and infantry combat. Yet despite these heavy losses, they were not defeated. As soon as Kingfisher ended, U.S. forces launched Operation Kentucky, another mission to push back the NBA in the same region. Operation Kingfisher was a brutal example of the Vietnam War's shifting tactics. The battle proved that the NVA could absorb huge casualties and still fight. They refused to retreat even when outgunned. The U.S. reliance on firepower was not always enough, even with tanks, artillery, and airstrikes. Marines suffered heavy losses. The war was turning into an attrition battle. Both sides were locked in a struggle where victory was measured in body counts, not territory. The siege of Ken became a symbol of Marine toughness, but it also showed the limits of U.S. strategy in Vietnam. Some historians believe the battle was part of Hanoi's plan to distract American forces before the Tet Offensive, which would come just months later for the Marines who fought. Kingfisher was a test of courage, endurance, and survival. Their sacrifices deserve to be remembered. Over 3 brutal months, U.S. Marines fought against overwhelming odds, facing relentless ambushes, artillery barges, and close-quarters combat. The enemy was fierce, the terrain was unforgiving, and the cost in lives was devastating. By the time the battle ended, on October 31st, 1967, over 340 Marines had been killed and nearly 1,500 wounded. The North Vietnamese Army NVA suffered massive losses, with over 1,100 confirmed dead, but they continued to fight. The war was far from over. Kingfisher showed the courage, sacrifice, and resilience of the Marines who held the line at Con. Their determination prevented a major NBAA breakthrough, but at a terrible cost. It was a battle of survival and endurance, proving that victory in Vietnam was never just about firepower. It was about the men on the ground fighting for each other. Even today, the battle remains a powerful reminder of the sacrifices made by those who served. To all the veterans of Operation Kingfisher and the Vietnam War, the battle America forgot. The Vietnam War had been raging for years. By 1969, American soldiers had been fighting for 4 long years, facing harsh jungles, brutal enemies, in a war that seemed to have no end back home. The American public was growing tired of the conflict. The horrifying images of young men dying in the jungles of Vietnam flooded newspapers and television screens. People were angry. Protests spread across the country. One battle in particular shocked the nation, the Battle of Hamburger Hill. It was a bloody fight over a hill that had no real strategic value. 72 American soldiers died, and many more were wounded. The battle became a symbol of the war's brutality and senselessness. But what if I told you that at the very same time, another battle was taking place just 100 miles south of Hamburger Hill? A battle just as brutal, if not worse, a battle that lasted 4 long weeks of battle, where American soldiers were pushed to their absolute limits, facing an enemy that seemed to never run out of men, bullets, or bombs. Unlike Hamburger Hill, this battle was kept a secret. The government didn't want more outrage from the American people. The soldiers who fought there were left forgotten, their sacrifices unknown to the world. This is the story of the Battle of Tam Khai, one of the most brutal and overlooked battles of the Vietnam War. Before we begin, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring more forgotten stories like this to life. Now let's dive into the battle that history tried to erase by 1969. The Vietnam War was at a turning point. The North Vietnamese Army NVA had become stronger, more organized and more determined than ever. The Americans were struggling to win, and back home, public support. For the war was collapsing, one of the most dangerous areas in Vietnam was Quang Province, located just 40 miles south of Dung. This region was crucial because it connected North and South Vietnam. Whoever controlled this province could control the movement of troops and supplies. The U.S. American Division responsible for defending this area was already stretched thin. But in early May 1969, something even worse happened. The NVA secretly moved 2 full regiments into the province. These were battle-hardened troops, highly trained tread, and ready to fight. The American Division had no idea what was coming. On May 12, 1969, the NVA launched a massive surprise attack within just 2 days. They took control of 80% of the province. American bases, fire support zones, and landing zones were under siege. The American Division was caught completely off guard. The attacks were fierce, and the Americans struggled to hold their ground. One of the hardest hit areas was Landing Zone Professionals, a critical fire support base. It was defended by the 1st Battalion, 46th Infantry Regiment, but they were badly outnumbered and struggling to survive against relentless enemy attacks, realizing that the American Division could not hold the province alone. The U.S. military called for reinforcements. The Military Assistance Command, Vietnam MACV, saw the importance of the battle and reacted quickly. They ordered 2 battalions from the legendary 1001st Airborne Division to be deployed to province. The operation was codenamed Operation Lamar Plain, and it would send the 1001st Airborne into one of the toughest fights of the entire Vietnam War. But the men of the 1001st Airborne Division had no idea what they were walking into. They were about to face some of the most intense jungle warfare of the entire conflict, one that history would later forget. The battle begins May the 12th to 14th, 1969. On May 12th, 1969, the North Vietnamese Army, NVA, launched a powerful surprise attack in Quang Nguyen Province. They struck with overwhelming force, targeting key American bases, fire support locations, and landing zones. The attack was fast, brutal, and well-planned. Within just 2 days, the NVA had taken control of 80% of the province. American forces, caught completely off guard, struggled to fight back. The American Division, responsible for defending the area, was quickly losing ground. The situation was becoming desperate. One of the hardest hit locations was Landing Zone LZ Professional, a critical fire support base defended by the 1st Battalion, 46th Infantry Regiment. The NVA focused heavy attacks on this base, knowing that if they took it, they could completely cut off American forces in the region. The U.S. soldiers at LZ Professional were trapped, running low on ammunition and facing constant mortar and machine gun fire. Realizing they were on the verge of losing the province, American commanders knew they needed help fast. The Military Assistance Command, Vietnam MCV, immediately called for reinforcements. Their answer: the 101st Airborne Division, one of the most elite and battle-hardened units in Vietnam. On May 14, 1969, 2 battalions from the 1001st Airborne were ordered to deploy to Quang Thien Province under Operation Lamar PL. Their mission was clear: stop the NVA, rescue their fellow soldiers, and take back control of the province. The units chosen for this dangerous task were 1st Battalion, 5001 Infantry Regiment, 1st Battalion, 5002 Infantry Regiment. Additionally, the 1st Battalion, 46th Infantry Regiment, already fighting in the area, would be attached to the task force. The men of the 101st Airborne Division were tough and experienced, having already fought in some of the war's most intense battles. But when they landed in Quang Nguyen Province, they had no idea that they were walking into one of the deadliest battles of their entire deployment. They were about to face weeks of relentless combat, brutal heat, and an enemy that refused to back down. The Battle of Tam Khai had begun. For arrival of the 10,001st Airborne Division, May 15, 1969. The 1001st Airborne Division was one of the most skilled and battle-hardened units in the U.S. Army. By 1969, they had already proven themselves in some of the toughest battles of the Vietnam War, but nothing could have prepared them for what awaited them in Quang Nguyen Province. On May 15, 1969, The first wave of 101st Airborne soldiers arrived in the province. They landed in large CH-47 Chinook helicopters, carrying only the most essential supplies, ammunition, weapons, and a few rations due to the urgency of the situation. Their heavier gear, food, and vehicles were scheduled to arrive later by truck and jeep. There was no time to rest the moment their boots touched the ground. The paratroopers were thrown into combat. Their first task was reconnaissance in force, moving through the jungle to locate enemy positions and attack them head-on. The 1st Battalion of the 501st Infantry Regiment was assigned to patrol near landing zone professional, where the heaviest fighting was taking place. They were ordered to push forward, clear enemy bunkers, and rescue trapped soldiers from the American Division. The men quickly realized that this was not like their previous battles. The terrain was harsh, hot, and unforgiving. The thick jungle, high humidity, and scorching sun made every movement exhausting. The soldiers were already suffering from dehydration and fatigue, but they had no choice but to keep moving. Adding to the danger was the unpredictability of the enemy. The NVA had spent years building an elaborate system of bunkers, tunnels, and hidden spider holes throughout the region. These underground networks allowed them to move unseen, ambush American patrols, and disappear before airstrikes could hit them. Over the next few days, the 101st Airborne pushed deeper into enemy territory. They encountered abandoned NVA, huts, hidden weapons caches, and the occasional sniper fire. But the main force of the enemy was still nowhere to be found. But the soldiers knew one thing. The enemy was out there waiting, and soon enough, they would make their presence known in the most brutal way possible. The Battle for Hill on May 21st, 1969. For days, the 101st Airborne Division had been patrolling the dense jungles of Quang Province searching for the enemy. The heat was unbearable, supplies were running low, and the soldiers were exhausted. But on May 21st, 1969, they finally found what they were looking for. Or rather, the enemy found them. Intelligence reports warned of a large enemy presence near Hill 187, a heavily forested ridge that overlooked key American positions. 3 companies from the 1st Battalion, 501st Infantry Regiment Bravo, Charlie and Delta companies were sent to investigate. They were accompanied by a recon platoon whose job was to scout ahead and locate the enemy as they moved toward Hill. 187, the recon platoon and Bravo companies suddenly came under heavy fire. The NVA had dug in and were waiting for them. Enemy soldiers fired from hidden bunkers, spider holes, and tree lines using AK-47's mortars and a powerful 12.7mm machine gun that pinned the Americans down. The Americans were in an open area with little cover, making them easy targets for 30 minutes. They were unable to move, trapped by relentless enemy fire. Every time a soldier tried to lift his head, bullets whizzed past, mortar rounds exploded all around them. The situation was critical. Charlie and Delta companies arrived just in time, forcing the NVA to withdraw temporarily. But this was only the beginning now that they knew where the enemy was hiding. The battalion received a new order. Take the hill, advancing uphill. 187 would be a nightmare. The NBAA had fortified their bunkers using stone walls, giving them a major advantage. Every American advance was met with machine gun fire, grenades, and mortar shells. Worse still, the enemy used underground tunnels to move between bunkers, reinforcing positions. Even after they had been cleared, American soldiers would take out one bunker only to be ambushed from behind by enemy soldiers emerging from hidden tunnels. The battle turned into a brutal close-quarters fight. Soldiers had to rely on grenade suppressive fire and bayonets to clear out enemy positions. The 101 Airborne was determined to push forward, but casualties were mounting and the battle was far from over. The heroism of Sergeant Santiago Arava amid the chaos and bloodshed on Hill 187. One soldier's bravery stood out. Sergeant Santiago Arava, a radio telephone operator in Charlie Company. His courage under fire would not only save the lives of his fellow soldiers, but also earn him the Medal of Honor, though it would take 45 years for that recognition to come, as his platoon fought its way up the hill. Arava was ordered to stay back and administer first aid to wounded soldiers. But as he moved between the injured men, he realized that the enemy had 4 machine gun bunkers positioned to wipe out his entire unit. His comrades were trapped, pinned down by relentless fire, and had no way to escape. Arabia had a choice: stay in cover or risk his life to save his fellow soldiers. He chose to fight, arming himself with two M16 rifles. Several hand grenades and extra ammunition. Avia crawled through the dirt and jungle brush toward the first bunker under heavy fire. He threw a grenade inside, taking out the enemy soldiers inside. Without hesitation, he sprinted to the next bunker, using his two rifles to lay down suppressive fire. He repeated this process 4 times, eliminating every machine gun position on the hill. His fearless assault saved his platoon from being wiped out and allowed the 101st Airborne to continue their attack. Despite his heroism, Araba's actions went unrecognized for decades. It wasn't until 2014, 45 years later, that he was finally awarded the Medal of Honor for his bravery. His story is just one example of the incredible courage displayed by the soldiers of the 1001 Airborne during the Battle of Tom Kai. But the fight for Hill 187 was far from over. The enemy wasn't done yet. 7 continuing combat. Hill 187 in Hill 376 late May, early June 1969. Despite Sergeant Santiago Araba's incredible heroism, the battle for Hill 187 was far from over. The 101st Airborne Division had managed to gain ground, but the NVA wasn't backing down. The fight continued with relentless attacks, brutal ambushes, and heavy casualties as the sun set on May 21st, 1969. American forces finally managed to secure a part of Hill 187, but the price was high: 12 men killed and 49 wounded. Yet the enemy was still out there. The NVA troops had not completely retreated. Instead, they had pulled back to a massive bunker complex at the hill summit, waiting for another chance to strike the next day. U.S. commanders made a tough decision. Rather than losing more men in direct assaults, they called in airstrikes. 3 250-pound bombs were dropped directly onto the enemy bunkers. The powerful explosions sent shockwaves through the jungle, collapsing tunnels and forcing the remaining NVA troops to flee. Hill 187 was finally under American control. But the battle wasn't over. The NVA wasn't just defending one hill. They controlled the entire region. As the 101st Airborne pushed forward, they encountered more heavily defended enemy positions. The next major battle took place at Hill 376, where another NVA stronghold was waiting for them on June 2nd, 1969. The 1st Battalion, 501st Infantry Regiment moved toward Hill 376. Just as before, the NVA was waiting this time in 18-man platoon from the 2nd Squadron. 17th Cavalry Regiment got pinned down by a much larger enemy force. For 7 straight days, the Americans fought to take Hill 376. The battle was just as intense as Hill 187, with soldiers facing a constant barrage of machine gun fire, mortars, and grenades. Once again, the enemy used tunnels and spider holes to launch surprise attacks, appearing behind American positions before vanishing underground. The fighting reached its peak on June 9th at dawn. Delta Company woke up to the sound of enemy mortar shells raining down on their position. Luckily, the bombardment was inaccurate, causing no casualties, but the attack was just the beginning. Reconnaissance reports indicated a large-scale enemy assault was coming as expected. Hundreds of NVA soldiers charged up the hill, firing everything they had at the Americans. Delta Company was in danger of being overrun. The air cavalry came just in time. American helicopters and fighter jets arrived, unleashing devastating firepower that broke the enemy's advance with air support and heavy artillery. The soldiers of the 101st were able to hold the line, but just as the battle seemed to be ending, disaster struck. A friendly fire incident. An American airstrike mistakenly hit Bravo Company, causing more casualties. Despite this tragedy, the soldiers continued their mission, determined to defeat the NVA. By June 12, 1969, the exhausted men of the 1001 Airborne were finally relieved from Hill 3766. Another brutal battle had ended, but the war was far from over. 8. The final push and conclusion of Operation Lamar Plain, June-August 1969. After weeks of brutal combat at Hill 187 and Hill 376, the 1001st Airborne Division was exhausted. The men had fought in intense heat with little rest, low supplies, and constant enemy ambushes, but there wasn't over yet. The North Vietnamese Army NVA had suffered heavy losses, but they were not completely defeated. Instead of fighting in large battles, they began splitting into smaller units, retreating into the dense jungles of Con Thien province. They avoided direct engagements and instead relied on hit-and-run attacks, booby traps, and sniper fire. American commanders realized that continuing the same tactics wouldn't work. Instead of launching more assaults on enemy-held hills, they changed their strategy. The mission now focused on tracking down the scattered NBA forces and destroying their supply roads for the next 2 months. The 101st Airborne carried out constant patrols and search missions. The jungle was filled with dangers, not just enemy snipers, but also hidden bunkers, traps, and underground tunnels. The enemy had built an entire network of hospitals, storage facilities, and living quarters beneath the jungle floor. One of the largest discoveries was made near Fire Support Base Boxer, where soldiers uncovered an extensive system of enemy bunkers and tunnels inside. They found weapons, medical supplies, and even makeshift classrooms, where the NBA had trained new recruits. These findings proved just how well prepared the enemy was, and why the battle had been so difficult. By August 11, 1969, the U.S. military decided it was time to end Operation Lamar Plain. The 1001 Airborne had pushed the NVA out of Con Thien province, and the remaining enemy forces had retreated into the mountains one by one. American units boarded helicopters, trucks, and transport planes heading back to their base at LZ Sally. Finally, on August 14, 1969, at 8 a.m., Operation Lamar Plain was officially declared over. In total, 126 American soldiers were killed and 444 were wounded, a higher death toll than the famous Battle of Hamburger Hill. Yet despite their sacrifices, very few people knew about this battle. It had been overshadowed by other events, and many of the fallen soldiers' families were even told their loved ones had died at Hamburger Hill instead of Tam Kai. The battle may have been forgotten by history, but the soldiers of the 101st Airborne never forgot 9. The aftermath and historical neglect. The Battle of Tam Kai was one of the deadliest and most grueling fights of the Vietnam War. 126 American soldiers were killed, and 444 were wounded, more than the infamous Battle of Hamburger Hill. But while Hamburger Hill became a symbol of the war's brutality, Tam Kai was largely forgotten. Why? The answer lies in the timing and secrecy surrounding the battle at the same time as Tam Kai. The media was focused on Hamburger Hill. The American public was outraged by the heavy losses over a hill with little strategic value. Anti-war protests grew stronger, and politicians faced intense pressure to justify why American soldiers were still dying in Vietnam. The U.S. military understood that revealing another brutal, costly battle just 100 miles south of Hamburger Hill would only add fuel to the fire, so the battle was kept out of the headlines. Many families of the fallen were even told their loved ones had died at Hamburger Hill, rather than at Tam Kai. For decades, Operation Lamar Plain and the sacrifices of the 101st Airborne remained unknown to the public. Veterans who had survived the battle felt ignored and forgotten. Unlike other famous battles, there were no movies, books, or documentaries to tell their story. It wasn't until much later that historians began uncovering the truth about what happened at Tam Kai. Veterans started sharing their experiences, and records from the battle were finally examined. In 2014, one of the heroes of Tam Kai, Sergeant Santiago ARA, finally received the Medal of Honor nearly 45 years after his bravery on the battlefield. But despite these efforts, the Battle of Tam Kai still remains unknown to most Americans. The soldiers of the 1001 Airborne Division fought with unmatched courage and determination. They endured weeks of relentless combat, surviving against impossible odds. Their sacrifices deserve to be remembered, not just by historians, but by everyone who values the bravery of those to serve. Their story should never be forgotten. The Battle of Tam Kai was one of the most brutal and overlooked battles of the Vietnam War. The soldiers of the 1001 Airborne Division fought through weeks of relentless jungle warfare, facing an enemy that was well prepared, deeply entrenched, and willing to fight to the death. They battled through Hill 187, Hill 376, and countless ambushes, suffering from extreme heat exhaustion and heavy casualties the enemy used. Underground tunnels, surprise attacks, and brutal close-quarters combat, making every day a fight for survival. Yet despite everything, the 1,001st Airborne never gave up. They pushed forward, adapted their strategy, and ultimately drove the North Vietnamese army out of Cang province. But their sacrifice was never truly recognized, while the world remembers Hamburger Hill. Tom Kai Kai remains forgotten, hidden in the shadows. Of history, the soldiers who fought and died there were denied the honor they deserved. Many of their families were misled, never knowing the true story of their loved one's final battle. Even decades later, the battle remains largely unknown. Few books or documentaries tell the story. Veterans who survived carried the memories of their fallen brothers. But the world moved on. It's time to change that. The men of the 101st Airborne Division displayed unmatched bravery, resilience, and sacrifice. Their fight was not for recognition, but for their comrades and their duty. Now it is our responsibility to honor their memory. The Battle of Tom Kai deserves to be remembered, not just as another fight in the Vietnam War, but as a testament to the courage and endurance of American soldiers. Their story should be told, their sacrifices honored, and their legacy preserved. In May 1969, American and South Vietnamese forces fought one of the most grueling and controversial battles of the Vietnam War, the Battle of Hamburger Hill. For 10 days, U.S. troops fought their way uphill 937, a steep jungle-covered ridge in the Isol Valley near the Laotian border. The North Vietnamese Army PAVN had turned the hill into a fortress, with hidden bunkers and machine gun nests waiting to cut down anyone who tried to take it. The battle became infamous because of the sheer brutality and high casualties. Soldiers described it as being ground up like hamburger meat, due to the relentless waves of attacks and the heavy resistance they faced. When the U.S. finally took the hill on May 20th, it seemed like a victory, but just weeks later, they abandoned it. This decision sparked outrage among troops and the American public. Why was Hamburger Hill so controversial? The battle was part of Operation Apache Snow, a U.S. mission to push North Vietnamese forces out of the Isol Valley. But Hill 937 had little real value. Commanders insisted it was a necessary fight, but soldiers questioned why they were ordered to charge up the same blood-soaked hill over and over, a battle like no other. Expecting light resistance, U.S. troops instead found a nightmare. Thick jungle, brutal heat, and an enemy dug in deep. Despite days of airstrikes and artillery bombardments, the North Vietnamese held strong when the hill was finally taken. It came at a terrible cost, and when the U.S. abandoned it, many wondered, was it all for nothing? The battle before. The battle before the first shots were fired on Hamburger Hill, the Isol Valley had already seen years of war. This valley was one of the most important battlegrounds in Vietnam, serving as a key supply route for the North Vietnamese Army PAVN. It was part of the Hoi Trail, a network of jungle paths used to transport troops, weapons, and supplies from North Vietnam into the South. For years, American forces had tried to disrupt the supply line. The valley was bombed, patrolled, and attacked in different operations, but the North Vietnamese kept coming back. They had deep tunnel networks, hidden bunkers, and a fighting spirit that made them nearly impossible to uproot completely. In 1966, the Po Vien had captured a U.S. Special Forces camp in the valley, forcing American troops to retreat. Since then, the valley had been in enemy hands, and U.S. commanders wanted to strike back. They knew the North Vietnamese were using the area to rebuild and plan future attacks. This led to Operation Apache Snow, a three-phase campaign to push enemy forces out of the ASO Valley. The operation involved thousands of American and South Vietnamese troops, airstrikes, and artillery barges. It was designed to weaken the Po Vien before they could launch another major offensive. Why attack Hamburger Hill 937? Later known as Hamburger Hill, was just one ridge in a valley full of hills and mountains. It was a towering jungle-covered peak, standing nearly 3,000 feet, 937 meters high. It didn't seem like a major target at first. It had no towns, no major roads, and no bases. But as American troops moved deeper into the valley, they realized something important. The enemy was there. Intelligence reports showed that a large force of North Vietnamese soldiers was hiding in the dense jungle of Hill 937, the U.S. commander in charge. Major General Melvin Zai ordered his troops to take the hill. At first, it seemed like a simple mission. The North Vietnamese usually avoided large-scale battles with U.S. forces preferring to strike and disappear, but this time they didn't run. They were waiting the enemy's plan. The North Vietnamese Army's 29th Regiment, known as the Pride of Ho Chi Minh, had dug in deep. They built a maze of bunkers, trenches, and tunnels, all hidden by the thick jungle. Machine gun nests were placed at key positions, and snipers were waiting in the trees. They had prepared for a long and bloody fight. The U.S. did not know how many enemy troops were on the hill. Intelligence reports were unclear, and aerial surveillance was nearly impossible because of the thick jungle canopy. This meant that when American troops began their assault, they had no idea what they were walking into. The soldiers sent to take the hill, the task of capturing Hamburger Hill, fell to the 101st Airborne Division. 3 of its battalions were given the mission, supported by Arvin Troops Artillery and air support. The main units included 3rd Battalion, 187th Infantry Rakisson, led by Lieutenant Colonel Weldon Honeycutt. This unit would play the biggest role in the battle. 2nd Battalion, 501st Infantry, sent to assist and reinforce when needed. 1st Battalion, 506th Infantry, ordered to attack from the south. These were some of the most experienced and battle-hardened troops in Vietnam, but even they were not prepared for what was waiting for them on Hamburger Hill. The plan of attack, Major General Zass and his officers came up with a strategy they thought would crush the enemy quickly. It was based on a search-and-destroy approach: send small patrols to find the enemy, then hit them with overwhelming firepower. If a fight broke out, U.S. troops would call in airstrikes, artillery, and helicopter gunships to finish the job. The problem was Hamburger Hill was a nightmare to fight on. The jungle was so thick that soldiers could barely see a few feet ahead. The terrain was steep and covered in sharp rocks, mud, and tangled vines. The weather was brutal, hot, humid, and rainy, making every step exhausting. On May 10, 1969, the first troops landed at the base of the hill. They expected light resistance. Instead, they walked into one of the deadliest fights of the entire war. What went wrong? From the very start, the U.S. underestimated the enemy. They thought the North Vietnamese would retreat after a few days of fighting. Instead, the PIAV had set up a killing ground. Every time American troops moved forward, they were hit by machine guns, mortars, and snipers. The enemy was invisible, hidden in deep bunkers and tunnels. Even airstrikes and artillery barely made a dent. Adding to the chaos, the jungle made communication almost impossible. U.S. units became disorganized, some getting lost in the dense terrain. The hill was so steep that helicopters couldn't land, making it difficult to bring in reinforcements or evacuate the wounded, the beginning of a bloodbath. By May 12th, the battle had turned into a grinding, bloody assault. Soldiers charged up the hill only to be pushed back by heavy fire. Some company lost nearly half their men in a single day. Colonel Honeycutt, the commander leading the charge, was known for being aggressive and determined. He ordered attack after attack, refusing to give up even as casualties mounted. Troops who survived later said it was one of the most horrifying experiences of their lives. One soldier described it as fighting ghosts. The enemy was everywhere, but no one could see them. As days passed, American commanders began to realize they had underestimated the fight. The North Vietnamese were not just defending the hill, they were prepared to die there. What comes next? Hamburger Hill was no longer just another fight in Vietnam. It was turning into a symbol of the war itself, a battle where bravery and sacrifice clashed with questionable strategy and unclear objectives for the American soldiers on the ground. There was no time for strategy debates. They had only one goal: survive and take the hill. In the next section, we will dive into the battle itself, the brutal combat, the human cost, and the moment when the U.S. finally took the hill. The first clash is May 13th to May 17th, 1969. On May 10th, 1969, the first American troops landed at the base of Hill 937, expecting light resistance. They had no idea they were walking into one of the most brutal fights of the Vietnam War. By May 13th, American patrols moving up the hill began to make contact with enemy forces. The North Vietnamese Army Pabaya 29th Regiment had turned the hill into a fortress. Their soldiers were hidden in bunkers, trenches, and tunnels, and they knew the terrain better than anyone. The 101st Airborne Division, led by Lieutenant Colonel Weldon Honeycutt, began their first direct assault on the enemy positions. But almost immediately, they were met with devastating machine gun fire, mortars, and snipers. The jungle was so thick that visibility was almost Z0. Soldiers could hear enemy gunfire all around them. But they couldn't see where it was coming from. The North Vietnamese had the high ground, and every time U.S. troops advanced, they were cut down. American forces relied on airstrikes and artillery to clear the hill. But the dense jungle absorbed much of the damage. The enemy bunkers were so well built that even after repeated bombings, the North Vietnamese kept fighting. By May 14th. American units had already taken heavy casualties. Soldiers were exhausted, wounded, and running low on supplies. The steep terrain made it nearly impossible to bring in reinforcements. Quickly, helicopters could only land in small clearings, and even then, they were easy targets for enemy gunners. As the fighting dragged on, morale began to drop. Many soldiers felt like they were being sent into a meat grinder, fighting over the same ground day after day. With no progress, the battle becomes a bloodbath. By May 17th, the battle had turned into a brutal, slow-moving grind. Every advance was met with intense enemy fire. Every victory felt temporary. The 101st Airborne Division was now fighting in multiple locations. Across the hill, attacks were being launched from both the north and the south. But the North Vietnamese had planned for this. They had dug deep defensive positions, with trenches and bunkers hidden beneath the jungle. Machine gunners and snipers waited for U.S. troops to get close before opening fire, cutting down entire squads in seconds. The terrain made everything worse. The jungle was so thick that soldiers had to hack through vines and tall grass. Just to move forward, the hill was steep, making every step a struggle. Rain turned the ground into mud, making it hard to keep weapons and equipment clean. Despite the overwhelming enemy resistance, Colonel Honeycutt refused to stop the attacks. He believed that if they kept pushing, they could wear down the enemy and break through some of his own men. Began to question his leadership. Soldiers resented being sent up the same hill over and over, only to get shot at from enemy positions that never seemed to weaken. At one point, U.S. aircraft accidentally bombed their own troops, killing and wounding dozens. The chaos of war made it nearly impossible to coordinate attacks, and friendly fire incidents were becoming common. By the evening of May 19th, the hill was still in enemy hands, and U.S. casualties had soared into the hundreds. The final assault, May 20th, 1969. After 9 days of brutal combat, commanders knew they had only one option left: a full-scale assault on the hill. On the morning of May 20th, after hours of airstrikes, artillery, and napalm attacks, American and South Vietnamese troops launched their final attack. 4 battalions attacked the hill at once, storming through the jungle trenches and bunkers. By now, the once dense jungle had been burned away by napalm and explosives, revealing the enemy's last strongholds. Soldiers engaged in brutal close-quarters combat, using grenades, bayonets, and rifles as they cleared out enemy bunkers one by one. Finally, after 10 days of relentless battle, American forces reached the summit of Hill 937. The North Vietnamese had been forced to retreat. But at a terrible cost. The cost of victory. Taking Hamburger Hill came at a huge price. 56 American soldiers were killed, and over 370 were wounded. Hundreds of North Vietnamese soldiers lay dead on the battlefield, with many more unaccounted for. The jungle was completely destroyed, leaving behind nothing but bomb craters, burned trees, and bodies. U.S. troops were exhausted, battered, and angry. They had spent 10 days fighting for a hill, only to learn that it would be abandoned just weeks later. Controversy and public outrage. When news of the battle reached the U.S., it sparked massive controversy. People were shocked at the high number of casualties and the fact that the hill had no real military value. Politicians, including Senator Edward Kennedy, criticized the decision to send young American soldiers to die for a hill that was quickly abandoned. The battle became a symbol of the Vietnam War, itself a conflict where soldiers were sent into brutal fights with no clear objective. The battle also shattered morale within the military. Many soldiers resented their commanders for ordering attack after attack, knowing the enemy was well prepared and dug in. Some troops were so angry at Colonel Honeycutt that they even tried to kill him. What did the battle achieve? Despite the heavy losses, US commanders insisted that the battle was necessary. They claimed that by taking Hamburger Hill, they had weakened the North Vietnamese army and disrupted their operations in the valley. But critics argued that the battle had no real long-term effect. The North Vietnamese simply moved to another hill and continued their war. Meanwhile, U.S. troops were left questioning their mission and their leaders. The impact on the Vietnam War. Hamburger Hill became a turning point in U.S. military strategy. After the battle, American commanders stopped launching large-scale frontal assaults instead. They focused on protecting their own troops and reducing casualties. At the same time, President Richard Nixon announced the first major troop withdrawals from Vietnam, marking the beginning of Vietnamization, the gradual shift of the war effort to South Vietnamese forces. A battle that defined a war. The Battle of Hamburger Hill wasn't just another fight in Vietnam. It was a symbol of the war itself. It showed the bravery and sacrifice of American troops who fought under some of the worst conditions imaginable. It revealed the flaws in U.S. strategy, where battles were fought at great cost. Without clear long-term goals, it fueled growing anger at the war, pushing more Americans to question why their country was still fighting in Vietnam for the men who fought there. Hamburger Hill was more than just a battle. It was a nightmare they would never forget. Immediate aftermath. The cost of Hamburger Hill on May 20th, 1969, after 10 days of relentless combat. Hill 937, later known as Hamburger Hill, was finally in American hands. But victory came at a terrible cost. Sea casualties and destruction. The battle had been one of the bloodiest of the Vietnam War. The casualties on both sides were staggering. 56 American soldiers were killed, and over 370 were wounded. The North Vietnamese Army, PA Von, suffered an estimated 630 dead, but many more had escaped or were buried under the rubble of their own bunkers. The once dense jungle covering the hill was completely destroyed, burned by napalm, ripped apart by our artillery, and cratered by bombs. For the men who fought there, the hill itself had become a graveyard. Bodies of both American and Vietnamese soldiers littered the battlefield, and the jungle had been turned into a wasteland of mud-shattered trees and craters. The psychological toll on U.S. troops. The survivors of Hamburger Hill were exhausted, traumatized, and angry. They had been sent up the same hill day after day, only to be cut down by machine gun fire mortars and SN snipers. Some companies lost half their men in a single day. Many soldiers began to question their commanders and the logic of the battle itself. Why had they been ordered to fight so hard for a hill that was later abandoned? What had they really accomplished? Some troops were so angry that they even considered killing their own officers. Reports surfaced of fragging attempts where soldiers would throw grenades into the tents of officers they blamed for reckless decisions. Colonel Weldon Honeycutt, who led the 3rd Battalion 187th Infantry, was particularly hated. Some soldiers placed a $110,000 bounty on his head, but despite multiple attempts, he survived. Why was the hill abandoned less than 3 weeks after taking Hamburger Hill? The U.S. Army abandoned it. The 101st Airborne Division withdrew from the area as part of the larger strategy to move U.S. forces away from remote regions. This decision infuriated many soldiers and sparked national outrage. Families back home watched reports of their sons being sent into one of the deadliest battles of the war, only for the hill to be given up without a fight shortly after. Major General John M. Wright, who replaced General Melvin Zoss as commander of the 1001st Airborne, tried to explain the decision, saying, "This is not a war of hills," that hill had no military value whatsoever, but that statement only added fuel to the fire. If the hill had no real value, why had so many men died for it? Political and public reactions. A nation in shock, the battle reached headlines across America, and the public reaction was one of outrage and disbelief. The Vietnam War had already been deeply unpopular, and Hamburger Hill became another symbol of a war that seemed directionless and costly. The controversy spread to the U.S. government. Senator Edward Kennedy took to the Senate floor to demand answers, calling the battle senseless and irresponsible. He criticized military leaders for sending soldiers into a fight that seemed to have no purpose. Other politicians, including Senators George McGovern and Stephen Young, echoed Kennedy's concerns. They questioned whether the U.S. military was wasting lives in battles that had no long-term significance. The media's role in turning the tide. The turning point in public opinion came when Life magazine published a shocking issue on June 27, 1969. The magazine featured the faces of 242 American soldiers killed in just 1 week of fighting in Vietnam. Although only a few of those soldiers had died at Hamburger Hill, the public associated the battle with a broader loss of life. The image of hundreds of young men, some barely out of high school, made the war feel even more personal and tragic for families back home. The media's portrayal of the battle shifted public perception against the war. Hamburger Hill became a symbol of everything wrong with the U.S. strategy in Vietnam: high casualties, clear objectives, and commanders willing to sacrifice soldiers for minor gains. The impact on U.S. military strategy. The backlash from Hamburger Hill forced a change in U.S. military tactics. Before the battle, the American war strategy had been based on maximum pressure, a policy of aggressively engaging and destroying enemy forces whenever possible. But after Hamburger Hill, General Crine Abrams, the commander of U.S. forces in Vietnam, ordered a shift in strategy. The new approach, called protective reaction, focused on minimizing U.S. casualties instead of launching large-scale attacks. The goal was no longer to engage the enemy at every opportunity, but to withdraw when possible and limit direct combat. At the same time, President Richard Nixon announced the first major troop withdrawals from Vietnam. His administration had been working on a policy called Vietnamization, which aimed to reduce U.S. involvement by transferring combat responsibilities to South Vietnamese forces. While Hamburger Hill wasn't the sole reason for these changes, it played a major role in accelerating the shift. How soldiers felt about the battle. Not all soldiers viewed the battle as a waste. Some veterans of the 1,001st Airborne believed that they had dealt a serious blow to the North Vietnamese Army. They argued that their efforts weakened the enemy and disrupted their plans in the Assau Valley, but for many the battle represented something darker, a failure of leadership, a loss of trust, and a deep sense of betrayal. Soldiers on the ground risked everything to take that hill, only to see it abandoned. Weeks later, one soldier later recalled, "We fought so hard for that hill, and in the end it meant nothing. We lost good men for nothing." Another veteran simply called it a slaughterhouse, a senseless waste of life. The anger didn't fade after the war ended. Many veterans carried the trauma of Hamburger Hill for the rest of their lives. Some refused to talk about it. Others struggled with PTSR, haunted by memories of friends who never made it home. The legacy of Hamburger Hill. Today, the Battle of Hamburger Hill is remembered as one of the defining moments of the Vietnam War. It exposed the flaws in U.S. war strategy and helped shift military thinking away from costly frontal assaults. It deepened public opposition to the war, adding to the growing demand for the U.S. to withdraw from Vietnam. For the soldiers who fought there, Hamburger Hill was more than just another battle. It was a turning point, a moment when many realized the war was lost long before the last shot was fired. The hill itself, now covered in jungle, once again stands as a silent reminder of the battle's brutality. The bodies are gone, but the scars of war remain both on the land and in the memories of those who were there. Final thoughts. The Battle of Hamburger Hill was a tragedy of war, a costly fight for a hill that held no real significance. It was a lesson in leadership strategy and sacrifice, a moment when soldiers fought bravely despite the failures of those who commanded them. But most of all, it was a reminder of the human cost of war for every soldier who fought there. Whether they lived or died, Hamburger Hill was a battle they would never forget. The Battle of Hamburger Hill was more than just another fight in the Vietnam War. It was a symbol of the entire conflict. It showcased the bravery and sacrifice of American soldiers. But it also highlighted the flaws in leadership strategy and decision-making that had plagued the war from the beginning. For 10 days, elite troops of the 1,001st Airborne Division fought in some of the worst conditions imaginable. They faced steep terrain, dense jungle, relentless enemy fire, and brutal weather. Yet they kept pushing forward. When they finally took the hill on May 20th, 1969. It should have been a victory. Instead, it became one of the most controversial battles of the war. What did Hamburger Hill prove? The battle revealed three important truths about the Vietnam War. Tactical victories didn't always mean strategic success. The U.S. won the battle, but within weeks the hill was abandoned. The enemy regrouped and continued fighting elsewhere. The high casualties felt like they were for nothing. Public support for the war was collapsing. The American people were already questioning the war, but Hamburger Hill intensified the backlash. The idea of young soldiers dying for a hill with no real value turned public opinion even further against U.S. involvement in Vietnam. The U.S. military had to change its approach. The backlash from the battle forced a shift in U.S. strategy, moving away from large-scale assaults toward Vietnamization, gradually handing over the war to South Vietnamese forces. The lasting impact for the soldiers who fought there, Hamburger Hill was not just another mission. It was a defining moment of their lives. Some saw it as a necessary battle, while others felt betrayed by their own leadership. Many veterans carried the trauma and memories of the battle for the rest of their lives. Today, Hamburger Hill remains one of the most debated battles of the Vietnam War. It is remembered not just for its brutality, but for the questions it raised about war itself. When is a battle worth fighting, and at what cost? This marks the end of the story of Hamburger Hill. But there are many more battles and untold stories from history that deserve to be remembered. The jungle doesn't forgive mistakes. In early 1970, deep in the treacherous terrain of Phuoc Tuy Province, South Vietnam, a unit of Australian soldiers marched into the unknown. Their mission? Root out a hidden enemy entrenched in the infamous Long Hai Hills, a labyrinth of caves, tunnels, and landmines controlled by one of the most elusive Viet Cong battalions in the war. What they faced was far more than guerrilla warfare. It was a brutal test of survival in terrain designed to kill. This was Operation Hammersley, a high-stakes campaign led by the 7th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, supported by tanks, artillery, and armored vehicles. But even firepower meant little when the enemy was buried underground, and the hills themselves were laced with death. Australia's role in the Vietnam War is often overshadowed by larger American operations, but this battle tells a story of courage, endurance, and jungle warfare at its most intense. It was a clash fought not just with bullets, but against heat, exhaustion, and the ever-present fear of the unseen. This is the untold battle for the Long Hai Hills. This is Operation Hammersley. By 1970, the Vietnam War had become a grinding, relentless conflict. Guerrilla tactics, ambushes, and booby traps defined the battlefield. For the Australian forces stationed in Phuoc Tuy Province, the enemy wasn't just hard to find. They were buried deep in the landscape, emerging only to strike and vanish without a trace. Australia's presence in Vietnam had steadily increased since 1962, but it wasn't until 1966 that they took full control of operations in Phuoc Tuy. Their responsibility was to pacify the province, a task made infinitely harder by the presence of the D445 Viet Cong Battalion. D445 wasn't a typical guerrilla unit. These fighters knew the terrain intimately. They built entire underground networks, bunkers, supply caches, command centers. Hidden within the Long Hai Hills, a strategic high ground near the coast. This area had become a notorious Viet Cong stronghold used to launch attacks, store weapons, and disrupt Australian patrols. Mines, sniper attacks, and sudden ambushes were routine in this region. Repeated Australian attempts to clear the hills had only temporary success. The enemy always returned. Worse, the hills were laced with booby traps and anti-personnel mines, some handmade, others Soviet or Chinese supplied. Every step was a gamble. By late 1969, intelligence revealed that D445 had once again reinforced the Long Hai Hills. Their presence threatened Australian fire bases, patrol routes, and local villages. Commanders knew that unless the hills were cleared once and for all, the Viet Cong would continue to dominate the region. And so a bold operation was conceived, one that would push into the enemy's territory, destroy their bases, and their operations in the south. It would require infantry, armored vehicles, artillery, air support, engineers, and nerves of steel. This would be Operation Hammersley, a name that would soon become synonymous with courage under fire. Operation Hammersley officially began on February 10, 1970, but its roots stretch back weeks prior. Australian intelligence confirmed that elements of the D445 Viet Cong Battalion had returned to the Long Hai Hills. Their presence wasn't just symbolic, it was a direct threat to local pacification efforts in Australian fire bases in the region. The plan was simple in theory, but dangerous in execution. Sweep through the hills, locate and destroy enemy bunkers, supply caches, tunnel complexes, and landmine stockpiles. The operation would also aim to sever the Viet Cong's access to nearby villages and coastal resupply routes. In short, it was a deep strike into the heart of enemy-held terrain. The main assault force would be the 7th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, 7R, a combat-proven unit known for its discipline and resilience. They would be supported by elements from the 1st Armored Regiment, wielding Centurion tanks and M113 armored personnel carriers from the 3rd Cavalry Regiment. Artillery support came from the 1st Field Regiment, ready to deliver heavy firepower when needed. Engineers from the 1st Field Squadron would be essential for clearing mines and demolishing bunkers. In coordination with American and South Vietnamese forces, the Australians prepared for a prolonged campaign. Supply lines were established, medevac protocols reviewed, and intelligence officers pored over aerial reconnaissance to identify likely enemy positions. This wasn't going to be a quick in-and-out raid. The terrain alone made movement slow and dangerous. The Viet Cong had home field advantage, hidden bunkers, traps, and sniper nests everywhere. But Australian commanders knew this operation had to succeed. The long high hills could no longer be a safe haven for the enemy. The time had come to face the jungle and whatever was waiting inside it. The opening days of Operation Hammersley were a brutal introduction to the kind of war the Australians would face in the long high hills. On February 10th, 7R began its advance, moving cautiously into the area just west of the hills. Almost immediately, the jungle reminded them that nothing came easy here. The dense foliage limited visibility, and the heat was suffocating. Every step was measured. Every tree could hide a sniper, and every patch of ground might be wired to kill. It didn't take long for the first contact. A forward patrol triggered a Claymore-style booby trap, wounding 2 soldiers. Moments later, the unit came under small arms fire from concealed VC positions. The Australians responded with disciplined return fire and quickly called in artillery support, forcing the attackers to withdraw. It was a textbook response, but it showed just how quickly things could go wrong. Throughout the week, 7R patrolled deeper into the area. They began uncovering a network of abandoned bunkers and destroyed supply caches. Some positions had been recently used, still stocked with ammunition and food. Others were eerily empty, the Viet Cong having vanished just before the Australians arrived. The threat of mines and improvised explosive devices was constant. Soldiers walked in single file, eyes scanning the ground, ears tuned to the unnatural. The engineers worked tirelessly ahead of patrols, using mine detectors in bare hands to disarm deadly traps. One M113 armored vehicle hit a mine concealed beneath foliage, blowing off its front left track and wounding its crew. The vehicle was later recovered, but it underscored the danger faced even by armored units. Despite the challenges, the Australians were making progress. Dozens of bunkers were located and destroyed. Hidden ammunition dumps were detonated. Maps were updated with new tunnel locations. Still, they hadn't yet drawn out the full strength of D445. The Viet Cong were holding back, watching, and waiting for the right moment to strike. The Australians knew it was coming. They could feel it in the jungle, that thick silence before the storm. Before we move into the full-scale combat that would define Operation Hammersley, ask yourself, had you ever heard this story before today? If this kind of detail, tension, and forgotten history speaks to you, give the video a like. It might seem small, but it helps us reach others who want to uncover the real battles behind the headlines. And if you haven't already, consider subscribing. We cover stories just like this, raw, untold, and real. Now let's step into the heart of the long high hills, where the real fight was just beginning. The turning point of Operation Hammersley came in the final days of February. After more than a week of skirmishes, booby traps, and cautious patrols, Australian forces began pushing deeper into the heart of the long high hills. Intelligence suggested the presence of a major Viet Cong base hidden within a dense section of jungle, fortified with tunnels and camouflage bunkers. This was no longer a routine sweep. It was a hunt for the enemy's core stronghold. On February 22nd, a company from 7R moved to investigate a suspected bunker system. As they approached the site, the lead elements came under sudden concentrated small arms and machine gun fire. The Viet Cong had sprung their trap. The Australians hit the dirt, returning fire as the jungle exploded with noise. The enemy was well entrenched, using elevated firing positions and pre-sighted fields of fire. It was a carefully prepared ambush. Within minutes, radio calls requested support. Artillery batteries from the 1st Field Regiment zeroed in, pounding the hillside with high explosives. Centurion tanks and M113s were brought forward, their armor shrugging off small arms fire as they rumbled into the kill zone. The Centurions opened fire with their 20-pounder main guns and coaxial machine guns, tearing through the jungle and bunker walls. Air support arrived overhead, dropping ordnance on suspected fallback positions. The ground shook and the jungle lit up in bursts of fire and smoke. The fighting raged for hours. Despite their fortified position, the Viet Cong began to break. Some tried to flee through escape tunnels. Others stayed behind, determined to delay the Australians as long as possible. By nightfall, the area was secured, but it came at a cost. Several Australians were wounded, and one was killed during the assault. As engineers moved in, they uncovered what the VC had tried to hide: an extensive tunnel complex with command bunkers, sleeping quarters, medical stations, and large weapons caches. Some tunnels were booby-trapped, others had been hastily abandoned. It was clear the Australians had stumbled onto a major operational center of the D445 Battalion. Over the next several days, additional combat broke out as patrols uncovered more outposts and small VC rearguards. These weren't mass engagements, but sharp, violent encounters. The enemy would strike quickly and fade away, leaving behind traps and casualties. But the psychological momentum had shifted. The Viet Cong had lost one of their most important strongholds, and for the first time in months, Australian forces had gained a firm foothold in the Long High Hills. Operation Hammersley was no longer a search mission. It had become a direct assault, and Australia was winning. After the intense combat of late February, it became clear that the Viet Cong were no longer fighting to hold ground. They were fighting to escape. Scouts reported signs of hurried withdrawals, blood trails leading into dense vegetation, half-buried caches, and abandoned packs filled with documents, maps, and personal effects. What had once been a well-organized VC-based system was unraveling. The D445 Battalion, battered and outmaneuvered, was melting back into the jungle. But retreat didn't mean safety for the Australians. If anything, the enemy's retreat signaled a different kind of danger: desperation. In the following days, Australian patrols continued their sweeps, but with heightened caution. The terrain was now mined more heavily than before. Claymores, tripwires, and pressure plates were buried across likely approach routes. One misstep could undo an entire operation. Engineers led the way, crawling, probing, detecting. They worked in silence, often under cover of riflemen scanning for snipers. One misjudged step could be fatal, and in several tragic cases, it was. As 7 RAR moved through the last remaining pockets of resistance, they discovered more tunnel networks, most of them collapsed or rigged to explode. The Viet Cong had either destroyed them or set traps to punish anyone who dared follow. Some tunnels extended deep into the hills, wide enough for a man to crawl through with equipment. These were not just hiding spots. They were full-fledged operating bases built over years of hidden labor. Despite the danger, Australians persisted. Day after day, they destroyed bunker systems, burned supply dumps, and rendered tunnels unusable with explosive charges. A few short engagements broke out with rearguard VC fighters, but these were quickly suppressed. By early March, the Long High Hills were no longer a stronghold. They were a scarred battlefield, silent and emptied. The D445 Battalion, though not annihilated, had been severely disrupted. Their command network was shattered, their weapons caches destroyed, and their ability to launch coordinated attacks in the region was crippled. Operation Hammersley was nearing its end. The hills that had once been a Viet Cong fortress were now under Australian control, at least for now. But every soldier knew in Vietnam, the jungle never stayed quiet for long. By the time Operation Hammersley concluded on March 9, 1970, it was clear the Australians had achieved a hard-won victory. The mission had lasted nearly a full month, and in that time, 7th RAI and supporting units had cleared large portions of the Long High Hills, destroyed extensive Viet Cong infrastructure, and struck a decisive blow against the D445 Battalion. Over 90 bunker systems were located and destroyed. Miles of tunnel networks were mapped, collapsed, or demolished. Large weapons caches were seized, including mortars, mines, AK-47 rifles, ammunition stockpiles, and food reserves. Intelligence documents captured during the sweep revealed enemy plans, command structures, and safe house locations throughout Phui Province. Most importantly, the Viet Cong had been forced to abandon one of their most valuable strategic positions. Their ability to stage attacks from the Long High Hills, once a major threat to both Australian forces and local civilians, was effectively neutralized. But the operation came at a cost. 9 Australian soldiers lost their lives and dozens more were wounded. Many of the casualties came from mines and booby traps rather than direct combat. It was a stark reminder of the kind of war being fought in Vietnam. a war where danger didn't just come from bullets, but from the ground itself. For the D445 Battalion, the losses were significant, though exact numbers remain unknown. What is clear is that they were no longer capable of mounting serious operations in the area for some time. Hammersley was considered a tactical and operational success, and it reinforced the importance of coordinated multi-branch operations involving infantry, armor, engineers, artillery, and air support. It also validated Australian doctrine focused on patrolling, ambush disruption, and jungle warfare tactics that would be carried into future operations. Operation Hammersley may not be as well known as battles like Con Thien or Coral Balmoral, but for those who fought there, it left a lasting mark both physically and mentally. The operation showcased the Australian Army's adaptability in one of the most unforgiving environments of the Vietnam War. In the dense jungle and treacherous hills, Australian troops demonstrated discipline, precision, and cohesion. It was a textbook example of how combined arms warfare, infantry working hand in hand with armor, artillery, engineers, and air support could overcome even the most entrenched guerrilla forces. It also highlighted the hidden dangers of jungle warfare. While traditional battles involved lines and fronts, the war in Phui was different. Mines, traps, snipers, tunnels. The enemy was invisible until the moment they struck. Hammersley proved that the true battle wasn't just against men with guns, but against an environment designed to kill. In the years that followed, the lessons learned from Hammersley would influence Australian military doctrine, especially in areas of mine detection, tunnel clearance, and jungle movement tactics. The psychological and physical demands of such operations reshaped how Australia trained its soldiers for combat in similar conditions. And though the D445 Battalion would eventually regroup and fight again, their setback in the long high hills stood as proof that Australia's soldiers could and would take the fight to the enemy's doorstep, no matter how dangerous it might be. Operation Hammersley wasn't about territory. It was about denying the enemy's sanctuary and proving that even in the most hostile terrain, discipline and determination could win the day. For the men of 7R and their supporting units, this wasn't just another mission. It was a deadly game of patience, nerves, and grit. Every hill cleared, every tunnel destroyed was paid for in sweat, blood, and silent courage. Though their names rarely make the headlines, the soldiers who fought in Phuoc Toi left a legacy, one carved into the jungle and into military history. If you want to hear more of these untold stories, the kind that don't make it into textbooks, you've just witnessed some of the most intense and forgotten battles of the Vietnam War, stories of courage, sacrifice, and survival that shaped history. Thank you for spending your time with us and watching this full documentary. We truly appreciate it. Let us know in the comments what you thought of this journey and which battle had the biggest impact on you. And if you want more untold stories from the Vietnam War and beyond, make sure to like this video and subscribe. There's so much more history we're going to uncover together. Until next time, stay curious and never forget the stories of those who fought.